What's up, metal and heavy music fans? Today we are ranking metalcore debut albums. Alright, y'all, I gotta say, I think this was the hardest one yet. Like, the top two tiers and the bottom tier were probably the easiest, but the three in the middle were a little tough. I'm still not 100% on them, and as you can see, I modified this slightly, but we should just jump right in. Let's go with As I Lay Dying with their debut album. This is Beneath the Encasing of Ashes, and this whole list is going to be interesting because metalcore is full of bands that definitely did not hit their stride on their very first take. I think most of them, it was the second or third album where they really kind of figured out their sound and got it all together. As I Lay Dying, definitely one of those bands. This is an okay album. It even has some like earlier versions on some stuff that ends up on the next album, which was definitely more of their breakout one. This one also, it's like darker, more in line, I would say, with kind of like the really early, like late 90s metalcore sound, and there's some like death metal elements in there too in a way, and then some weird kind of like drifty, almost post-metal-y segments. This album's okay. I'm kicking myself a little bit because I did own a physical copy of this and I traded it, and now it's like kind of expensive to get, the last I looked anyways. But anyways, I'm going to put this one at C tier. All right, and then we got a really early one, Coalesce with Give Them Rope, and I like Coalesce. I never became like a super fan of them. Definitely one of the earlier metalcore bands to come out. This album though, not big on it. In particular, the vocals, I think, is what turns me off to this one the most. And so for me, these are all going to be ranked largely just in order as far as I enjoy listening to them, basically. There's too many albums here for me to go on any more criteria than that. So we're going to put this one at D tier. If I were to grade it, if I were to give it a review, it wouldn't actually be a D, nor would... There's really no bad albums. Maybe a few bad albums on this list. I enjoy almost everything here, but again, we're ranking. I want this to be interesting to look at. All right, bleeding through Portrait of the Goddess. So me personally, I really enjoy this album quite a bit. It was one of the earlier metalcore albums that I owned, and owned a physical copy of, I think, too. And it's just really good. I feel like this is one of their best albums. This is Love, This is Murderous, arguably better than this one in some ways, but not in others, really. Like, that was their breakout album, but I think this album's a little bit more, like, consistent than that album. It doesn't have, like, the big banger hits, but it's, like, totally solid all the way through. So I'm going to put this one at A tier. Out of this entire group, it is one that I really enjoy still re-listening to this day. All right, then we have Zao, the mighty Zao with All Else Failed, another very early metalcore band. They were kind of like in the first 4, 5, 6 bands to kind of like hit the scene with this sound, and this was one of those really early albums out of their discography, which is really good. You should check out my Zao tier list if you have not. It's not one of my favorites, I would say, by any stretch. It's decent, but they've got far better ones. And y'all, if you haven't listened to the Crimson Corridor, their latest album, like, you stop sleeping on that, because that is just like one of the best albums of 2021. But anyways, for this one, I'm going to put it at a B-. It's good, but it's not great. All right, then we have A Day to Remember with And Their Name Was Treason, and this is an album I feel very comfortable putting at the bottom tier. I do not enjoy this album. When I did my A Day to Remember tier list, there were definitely a few people in the comments that were really mad that I called this album cringy, but you know, I know most metalcore, especially from this era, has a lot of cringy lyrics, but this one in particular, especially listening to it now, just rubs me the wrong way. Like, I don't get a lot out of it. It's a lesser release for them, and again, they just have better albums. Like, if I'm going to listen to A Day to Remember, there are so many better choices than this one, so it's bottom for me. All right, then we have Architects with Nightmares, and I quite enjoy this album. Another band where definitely there are far stronger releases in their discography, but it's, for a first release, like, it's one of the stronger ones. However, on this list, there are still, like, far more enjoyable albums, I would say, and this one's just, like, Architects for me is once they get into their gentler style, that's where it like truly becomes Architects for me. So I still feel comfortable ranking this one a little bit lower. I'm going to put it in the B- tier. Then we have Behind Silence and Solitude from All That Remains, a band who I enjoy the 2 albums after this a lot. Like, they would be ranked amongst my favorites if we were talking about those albums. This album is another one where they definitely have not hit their stride yet. The vocals are really kind of wavering, not very strong. There's not a good foundation there. The guitar work is kind of muddled. Production, understandably not very good. And so to me, like, it's this Darkened Heart where they really blow up. So I'm going to put this one also at D tier. Not that great. Bring Me the Horizon, Count Your Blessings. I debated including this album because it's more of like a deathcore album, but it's a good one. Like, it's really consistently pummeling, really aggressive. The production kind of fits the time. I like the album cover. And I kind of like this better than some of their other stuff. I know they've gotten more dynamic and like objectively, creatively, I guess you could say. They've definitely broadened their scope, at least. But I just don't really like the poppier stuff that they're doing. And so this, to me, like, I'm cool with it. I'm going to put it at a B tier. I'm definitely a bigger fan of We Are the Romans, but Botch, like, they have a very short but very strong discography. If you're not familiar with them, they are very much akin to, like, the mathcore side of the scene. Very kind of punctuated, aggressive kind of sounding music. I always say it sounds like cold concrete, just like getting bashed into it. Some playing with time signatures, lots of panic chords, that kind of stuff. And yeah, they're fantastic. I'm going to put them up at A tier. And if you have not listened to them, go listen to that. All right, Haste the Day with Burning Bridges. I had a lot of fun with this album, but it's not a great album. Like, listening to it all the way through, the production's kind of thin. It doesn't have a lot of meat on the bone. I do love The Closest Thing to Closure. I bang that song still pretty regularly. So, you know, it's got some strong points. So yeah, I wouldn't put it at the bottom because I can enjoy listening to it, but I don't think it belongs like in the higher level tiers, especially once you see some of the stuff we're going to be putting in there. So I'm going to put this one at C tier. A little bit similar to Botch, we've got Dead Guy with Fixation on a Coworker, another very early formative metalcore and mathcore album that definitely set some of the blueprint for some of the sounds we heard from then on, really. Like, a lot of people taking these elements and kind of running with them. And great album, really, again, aggressive, a little bit like neck snapping and some of the time changes and weirder stuff that they're doing. I'm definitely going to put this one at A tier. All right, absolute classic for me, Protest the Hero with Kezia. Another one that some people would argue, is it even a metalcore album? I'd say out of their discography, this is probably the most metalcore sounding one, but obviously with a lot of those like progressive elements, more focus on clean singing, but the instrumentation is there, the connection is there, those mathcore elements again kind of seeping into their sound as well. I absolutely adore Protest the Hero, and like another really strong discography, but a great debut that I listened to a lot, particularly in college, like after it had come out and been out for a little while, but somebody on campus got me into them, and I never looked back. This is S tier for me. It Dies Today with the Caitiff Choir. Very fun album that I think some people have forgotten. Not a great band, I would say. Like, to me, this is their only, like, really great disc to spin. Like, there's a lot of great tracks on here, a lot of fun track names too, a lot of great sing-along moments and scream-along moments. The instrumentation is really solid. I particularly remember the old school website days where like there was a countdown for this album to release on the band's website, and I would go check it, and there were 2 songs you could play, and I would spin them constantly just in anticipation. Like different times for music, even though it wasn't that long ago, but we've come such a long way. Anyways, I'm going to put this one at B tier. Or we got Parkway Drive with Killing with a Smile, and I'm just going to say it again, I really think Parkway Drive is super overrated. I really do. There's a few bands on here that came here kind of late to the game, and they just sort of like latched on to what was already being done, and they didn't really add anything else to it. Simple as that. Like, when I listen to their music, I just don't hear anything exemplary, anything of note beyond the bands that did it before them, which is important to me. Like, if you're going to jump onto the genre late and be the newcomer, like, you should be bringing some evolution. It could be totally subtle, but something to like really like carve yourself out. But people seem to love this band. I hear they're like nice guys, and they seem to be good at like kind of building a strong fan base and everything. And so good for them. Not a bad album by any means, but it's just so like kind of generic in my mind. So this is where everybody else gets mad at me, because I know there's a lot of Parkway Drive fans, even in my audience, but I'm still going to put this one at C tier. We got Atreyu with Suicide Notes and Butterfly Kisses. Never really been an Atreyu fan. I liked kind of that one big album that they had with like the vampire girl on the cover. That was okay. But this album is, I said there's a few albums on here that I do think are bad. I think this album is bad. Like the singing is bad. The instrumentation is not great. The production, even for an album of this era, is not very good. I just dislike this album quite a bit, so it's going to go in D tier. On the flip side, August Burns Red with Thrillseeker. Now this one's interesting because this is easily my least, well, it was my least favorite August Burns Red album. But I think actually their latest one may actually be my least favorite now. But their discography is so strong and consistent that I still think their worst is like better than a lot of the albums on here. Like they came strong with the riffs and an intensity, and this isn't even with their like current vocalist. This is the one album with the original vocalist, and I like the direction they went from here. But it's still a really great album with lots of great songs. I'm going to put it at A tier. I still enjoy listening to it. All right, Trivium with Ember to Inferno. Another one where I'm not a big Trivium fan. I did a Trivium tier list, so you can hear my thoughts on the whole discography. I am okay with this album because I kind of like their early metalcore stuff. But this debut, again, the album after it is a better attempt at what they're trying to do here. So I'm still going to put this one at D tier. Lots of weaknesses in the vocals, the instrumentation, kind of across the board. It's not terrible, but it's not very good. All right, Asking Alexandria with Stand Up and Scream. I was actually surprised at how much I enjoyed listening to this album. Now, this is another band, I would say, that came in kind of late, didn't really add a whole lot to the game, at least not at first, and I absolutely loathe the direction that they've gone now. This more kind of like hair metal-y, melodic, kind of like whiny music. Not into that. But this album, though, is just like straight up metalcore goodness, just the way that you like it. And I think they do it well enough that I enjoy listening to this one even more than some of the other ones lower down on this list. So I'm actually going to put it at B-. All right, Bullet for My Valentine with 2005. Another band that I'm not really a big fan of. The new album was kind of okay. But yeah, this one, as far as like mid-2000s metalcore albums go, really good. And going back to it again, I was genuinely surprised. Like, oh, I do kind of like this. There are a lot of really catchy choruses in particular mixed up with the more aggressive parts. And yeah, I had a good time with it. And I'm surprised that I'm actually going to put it up at B tier. All right, Poison the Well, Opposite of December. If you know me, I did a Poison the Well tier list. It was one of my earlier ones. I absolutely adore this band and everything that they put out. This is S tier for me. I have a lot of bias because it was definitely another one of those like really early albums for me, but it was early in the genre. Like to me, because this came out in 99, and that was like a big pivotal time where I feel like they solidified the blueprint for what most bands at that time then figured out and kind of started doing from there when they were doing it better until Gent came around and kind of shook things up again. But you know, there were bands before Poison the Well, obviously. There were albums before this one, but I feel like this is like the moment where everything sort of ironically coalesced, and it wasn't Coalesce that did that. But yeah, monumental album, absolutely fantastic. So many great songs. All right, Cave In with Until Your Heart Stops. Oddly enough, I like never spent a ton of time with Cave In, despite the fact that they were very closely knit with like a lot of the other bands I was listening to at that time, like Poison the Well. I think they were on Trustkill with Poison the Well, too, along with a few of these other bands. And going back and listening to this one, I don't think I had listened to it a lot, but I really enjoyed it. And speaking of bands, like kind of doing something different, forming their own kind of spot within the sound, their own niche, Cave In definitely does that. And their later albums even, too, like they've evolved into something kind of totally different that I'm sort of like on the fence with. But if you're familiar with Brodsky and his work also with Mutoid Man, he's also been working with Quicksand lately, which is really cool just to see how far he's come and what an artist he is. He was on that latest Converge album too. Like, this is an early album for him. So yeah, props to him and the whole band. I'm going to put it at B tier. All right, we got Hatebreed with Satisfaction is the Death of Desire. Another one that might make people mad because I think this is a pretty well-liked album. I like Hatebreed enough. I actually really liked that new album. Like, that was super motivational, and I kind of like where they went from here. This album strikes me as a little bit too kind of rah vocals, where, and all of the albums kind of have that issue, but I feel like this one in particular just gets a little bit grating to my ears. I think if I'd been more into Hatebreed back in the day and formed more nostalgia attached to it, I'd probably like it more, but listening to it now, it just feels incredibly dated, which, you know, other people will say about these other albums. But yeah, it just doesn't do a ton for me, but it's definitely an important album and a solid one. I'm going to put it at B-. All right, Attack with Someday Came Suddenly, the kings of Crabcore and the classic Stickly. This album's kind of fun. It really is. Like, it's very like goofy and synthy, and arguably it's a little bit mismatched with some of the other stuff on this list, but I felt like they needed to be included. I'm going to put them at like C tier. It's a good time, but it's original too. Like, I'll give them credit for that, is what they were doing was pretty different, and it's even got some like almost Nintendo core sounding elements, which I didn't really represent a ton on here, but I've got too many albums as it is, y'all. So I'm going to put this at C tier and leave it at that. The Dillinger Escape Plan, Calculating Infinity, you know where this has to go. It's got to be at S tier, and hopefully that redeems me a little bit for putting it at the bottom of the Dillinger Escape Plan discography tier list, because again, it is my least favorite Dillinger Escape Plan album, but again, the quote-unquote worst, which there is no such thing, but my least favorite Dillinger album is still better than the vast majority of anything on here. So important to being a foundation for mathcore going forward and where they would evolve from then. But what a different and wild sounding album. I wish I had been around. I was around, but I wasn't into like mathcore and even like metalcore at that time. I was still pretty young, but I would have loved to have like reacted to this as this like new movement that was happening. But anyways, let's move on. All right, another important foundational act, we have Earth Crisis with Destroy the Machines, which as I recall, I was like looking into like who dropped like the first true metalcore release, and I think Converge hit first, I think, and then Earth Crisis was right there too. So right there in that late 90s group, foundational to metalcore. But unfortunately, this is another album where it's kind of very rah, very kind of gruff, very straightforward to the point, definitely still holding on to a lot of that hardcore ethos that this all kind of like blossomed out of to begin with. And so for the time, you can appreciate that, and I respect this for its importance within the genre, but it's not particularly fun to listen to. So ultimately, I'm going to put it at B just to warrant its importance, but also note that it's not one of my favorites overall. All right, Norma Jean with Bless the Martyr and Kiss the Child. Some people are already yelling, that's not their first album. They were Ludacris first. Well, guess what? They were Ludacris. They weren't Norma Jean, so it doesn't count. Not going to count it. Sorry. Too bad, but I also know what you're talking about, and I have heard that album. It's okay. This is a landmark album, though. Like, another one that's really important to mathcore fans, even though it's not like the most mathy technical thing, but there's definitely those elements on here. Still really solid to listen to. I think that the band has kind of evolved even further beyond this sound, but as far as albums that came out around this time, everyone was talking about it. If you were into metalcore, you could not avoid somebody bringing up, have you heard this album? And it really is great. And it's a must listen for you kind of like metalcore history nerds out there. S tier. All right, next up, we might as well follow that up with the Chariot, which spawned off of Norma Jean, because this is the original vocalist from that album who departed then after and formed the Chariot, and this album is called Everything is Alive, Everything is Breathing, Nothing is Dead, Nothing is Bleeding, if I got that right. Another very long title. And I love the Chariot, another fantastic discography, but I gotta say, I bought this album, I think, without even having heard more than like a single, because again, those were the times, like you just ordered stuff and a lot of times you didn't have an opportunity to hear it in advance. But yeah, I was pretty disappointed because this is a very noisy record, and y'all know me, I love my noise and feedback and everything, but it's like so to another level. There's so much like amp feedback. It's a very live sounding album. And so it kind of turns me off. It's hard to listen to, genuinely. It's a good one, and I think it's stronger than a lot of other stuff on here, but it's just, again, I'm ranking these a lot in terms of how much do I enjoy re-listening to them over and over again, and so it kind of drops it down in that way. I'll put it pretty high up on C tier, but it's C tier nonetheless. All right, we have Converge's first album, Halo and Haystack, and they were not fully Converge at this point, I will definitely say. So it pains me because I'm a diehard Converge fan, one of my all-time favorite bands, but I don't really enjoy listening to this album. It doesn't have a ton to offer. Like, easily, as soon as you move past this album, that's when you start to get into the real meat of that Converge sound. This is something a little bit different. There's a little bit more like kind of post-hardcore, almost like emo-y kind of stuff in there too, which is, you know, kind of, it's still mixed into the sound on some level, but to a different degree here. So even though I love the band, I'm going to rank this really low. I'm going to put it at D. Not at the bottom, though. Definitely not at the bottom. Put it closer to the front. All right, Killswitch Engage with Killswitch Engage. And End of the Heartache takes a couple of these songs and kind of beefs them up, makes them even stronger. That's a better album overall, but really strong debut. Like, I own a copy of the original before they even reissued it, so I'm happy to be holding on to that. But it's great, like another really strong out-of-the-gate album. And this was a foundational album in terms of that shift from the hardcore influence to the more like Gothenburg influenced metalcore bands, where you were kind of ripping At the Gates and In Flames riffs and applying those same types of vocals to them. Great album, very melodic, lots of great riffs, lots of great vocal lines. Fantastic. Not quite S tier, but I'm going to put it at A tier. All right, Every Time I Die, rest in peace, maybe it'll change, I don't know, but, you know, really sad about that. Another one of my all-time favorite bands, and this is Last Night in Town, which, again, Dan always gets mad at me because it's my least favorite Every Time I Die album, but it's another case of, like, they hadn't fully formed their sound yet. Like, Hot Damn is where it, like, takes hold, and then I'd say over the next 2-3 albums after that is where they really started to kind of, like, hit their stride in terms of that Southern fried hardcore and mathcore kind of stuff. And so they're so cool because they come in with that completely different guitar sound. Like, again, most of these are coming in with that like more hardcore influence or some of those melodic death metal influences. These guys come in with straight up like dirtbag blues riffs and just like that southern flair, even though they're from New York. So yeah, fun album, a little bit raw, a little bit rough. If this were Hot Damn, I'd probably throw it up at S tier, but as it stands, I'm going to put this one at B-. All right, The Bled, Past the Flask, another band with a pretty short discography, but this one is really great. I spent so much time listening to this one in high school. There are so many catchy sing-along moments, scream-along moments on this one. I'm going to pop it up at S tier because, like, I have so many memories attached to it, too. Definitely got some nostalgia goggles, but I even pulled it up in my iTunes again and realized that I've, like, hearted almost every song. It's hard to just pick favorites, and they're all a little bit different, so, yeah. The Bled, Past the Flask, awesome. Also awesome, Periphery, with their first self-titled record now called Periphery I, since we've been numbering them all except for Alpha and Omega. And another one, gotta be S tier, gotta be like way up there too. Like, these guys pioneered, for better or worse, I know some people will probably be mad at them for this, but they pioneered the gent as metalcore sound. Obviously, Meshuggah kind of like created that gent sound to begin with, but Periphery was the band that truly like pushed it forward into metalcore. There were other bands doing it before them, like Sixth, but it didn't really catch on. They were like a little bit too early. Dang it, I just realized I don't have Sixth on here. I probably should, but too many to begin with. So yeah, anyways, Periphery, S tier for me. I remember the first time I heard Icarus Lives as this album was dropping, and it just blew me away, and I still enjoy them. I love every single album, and seeing them live was fantastic. All right, another Trustkill band here with Walls of Jericho and the Bound Feed the Gagged, and this was definitely one of my earlier introductions to metal bands with female vocalists, and man, is Walls of Jericho just like spitting pure fire in general, but on this record too. I think it was like them, Arch Enemy, and Kitty were kind of like the triad that made me learn that I love that. Like, there's something about that just really like I enjoy, and it speaks to me, and it's just badass. And this is a fantastic album that I had not heard anything from in a very long time for whatever reason. And I listened to it just today before recording it, and I was like, holy shit, this thing is fucking heavy. It's so good. Start to finish, like, there is no downtime. It's incredible. It really is. So if you haven't checked out Walls of Jericho, especially this earlier stuff, definitely do that. I'm going to put it at A tier. All right, Hopesfall, The Frailty of Words. Kind of the, like, disowned record for whatever reason. Like, last I had checked on their website, they didn't even include this in their discography. And they had quite a bit of lineup changes since this album, I believe, too. But I think this one and the EP after are kind of my favorite Hopesfall releases. Like, the Satellite Years is great, and it's kind of a landmark album, too. But this one, in terms of just pure aggression and just the riffage, the opening riff to this album is just like, it will destroy you as soon as that scream kicks in, too. Really good stuff, really fun. Not like top shelf, but I'm going to put it at B tier. All right, another band that I really love, and I just put up a review for their latest album, which I also really enjoyed, and this is Under Oath with Act of Depression. Unfortunately, this is another one where I love the band, but I do not love this album. It's easily my least favorite in their discography. It's a little bit rough, not really particularly enjoyable, I would say, to listen to. If I'm going to grab an Under Oath album, there are so many others I would pick, like They're Only Chasing Safety or Defying the Great Line, so on and so forth. I'm going to put this one at D tier. All right, after the Burial Rare Form, this is an interesting one too, because there's two versions of this album. There's this version, and then there's the version with the green highlight of the guy on the cover that has the new vocalist, and the new vocalist is superior in every way. I think that's the one thing that brings down the original debut with the old vocalist, is his vocals are really kind of like ear piercing. Some people might like it, but he makes a lot of like weird noises too, and I'm just like, I don't know about this guy. But the guitar work, y'all, is fantastic. So if you're going to choose which version to listen to, I would listen to the version with the newer vocalist, because then you get all the great riffs, but also with a much stronger vocal performance too. So if we were doing the updated version, that would be S tier, but for this version I'm going to put it at B tier. Luckily the riffs are strong enough that they kind of like make up for the weaker points, but there it is. All right, Between the Buried and Me with Between the Buried and Me, and another one where absolutely in love with this band. I actually got to see them live playing Colors 2, which was just like a culmination of decades of listening to this band, and that was fantastic. But yeah, this album, it's okay. It's just okay. They weren't even fully taking themselves like that seriously at this point. They don't play a ton of these songs live regularly, I would say, compared to some of the other albums. Jumping forward to The Silent Circus, like, to me, that's already basically an S tier album, but this one's a little bit on the weaker side. I'll probably put it at B- tier, because like I can enjoy it. It's there's nothing really bad on it, but it's not something that I regularly kind of go back to. All right, Unearth with The Stings of Conscience, a band at some point I heard called like the Slayer of Metalcore. Not a great album, not a fantastic debut. You hear some like rumblings of where they're going, but it's not as good as The Oncoming Storm, which again is like, that's the breakout album with all the amazing solos, the amazing riffs, the more memorable songs. So I'm going to put this one at C tier. All right, Avenged Sevenfold with Sounding the Seventh Trumpet. I don't know if this is going to be controversial, but this is another one that I would say is pretty weak. There's some elements of their sound there, but like the vocals are a little bit rough. Like they hadn't quite gotten to the point where they could really belt it out and really get those notes where they needed to be to bring the like really epic melodic flourishes they were getting to. The riffing is not as strong. The drumming is like already pretty killer out of the gate, but not an enjoyable album to listen to. In fact, I might even want to trade this out with something like, if I'm really getting down to it, I'll trade this out with Converge. I'm going to put this at D, and I'm going to put Converge up at C, because I'd rather listen to the first Converge album than that first Avenged Sevenfold album. Now, that might be controversial. If it is, let me know down in the comments. All right, speaking of those Gothenburg-influenced bands, we've got what was sort of called like the American Gothenburg metalcore band, and that is Darkest Hour with The Mark of Judas. This is another album I spent so much time with. Absolutely killer, and it really is basically taking like those At the Gates and In Flames riffs and then applying a more metalcore kind of aesthetic to it and metalcore vocals to it. But right out of the gate, the opening riff on this thing again is just like so explosive, so much fun, fantastic. I'm going to put this one at the top of A tier, it could almost make S tier, but I had to make some room. Then we have Of Mice and Men with Of Mice and Men, and this one, like, another band that I never really got into, but I don't really know why. Like, I think it's kind of like Parkway Drive, where they came in late and they didn't really contribute anything new to kind of catch my ear. But I actually do think that I like this album a bit more than that Parkway Drive album. I just think it does the blueprint really well. I just wish that they kind of like brought some new stuff into the fold. I enjoyed their new album too, which was pretty solid and did some really good stuff with the melodic elements, but still kind of inconsistent and not really like pushing hard enough to like really distinguish itself. But anyways, I'm going to put this one at B-. And then we're going to wrap up with one of my all-time personal favorites and a very early album again that I actually owned a physical copy of, and that is From Autumn to Ashes with Too Bad You're Beautiful. I absolutely still adore this album. It's a little bit messy, but like in a really charming, strange way where everything comes together. There's so much like true emotion woven into this thing. I even did a film studies class in high school where I had to make a little short film, and we set it to the final track on this one. And I think I still have that on VHS in the crawl space somewhere. Maybe someday I'll show everyone that. But to me, this is S tier. Just really fun stuff. Another album where if you haven't checked it out yet, you definitely should. But y'all let me know down in the comments how would you rank these albums, and check out this playlist for plenty more metalcore and other metal tier lists. But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.